I'm mostly in the tech scene, although lately I've been dabbling in indie game design, part of how I'm spending my fun employment. And today I'm going to talk about games, narrative, and story. And on the narrative and story side, I'm not going to be as rigorous with the semantics as John was yesterday as he introduced us, but I'll try and roughly adhere to the way we've been using narrative and story all weekend. There we go. Rough outline, I'm going to talk about interactive media in general, which is mostly games. I'm going to talk about Lunar narrative, which is the intersection of play and narrative. Then I'll go specifically into my explorations around storytelling games. And then finally I'll talk about Plotypus, which is a storytelling game that I created and published over the past year. So interactive media, again, mostly games, but also interactive fiction, such as Choose Your Own Adventure, or the latest creations that have been happening on Twine, I think are really amazing, really powerful, for multiple reasons and multiple ways. Really good at getting your narrative or your thoughts into somebody else's mind, or getting them to empathize with specific points of view. And the reason it's so effective, especially vis-a-vis books or movies, is because of the interactive dimension of it. And because it's interactive, it's easier to understand complex systems, or you can convey really the way complex systems interact with each other. And as I said before, you can get the empathy angle, especially when the player is controlling a specific character, their identity gets attached to that character. And so there are a bunch of benefits of games. I'm going to run through a handful of them quickly. So games, as I said, are great at empathy. This is a game called Cart Life, where you're playing an immigrant to the US who's struggling to get by, and it's really, really hard. They're great for just escapism and power fantasy. They're good at modeling complex systems and simulating, saying, in the starting condition, where do things go? This is SimCity. They're good at just generally building critical thinking skills and puzzle solving skills, like in Portal. This is a picture of Dwarf Fortress, so it's really good at mastery. This system is not only incredibly complex, but the interface is also incredibly complex. And Dwarf Fortress, I tried playing it, I couldn't really get into it just because the learning curve was so steep, but people really love it. And this is a system that's so complex that you're simulating the growth of a colony of dwarf miners, but the simulation goes from fractal world creation of continents forming and breaking up before the game even starts, to simulating the individual joints between body parts of the dwarves so they can lose limbs. It's crazy, and to master it is like an exercise of years. Games can also be really good for team building, as anyone who's played a cooperative or massively multiplayer online game knows. It's really good as a creative outlet, so there's been a tremendous explosion of creativity in Minecraft in terms of creating all sorts of interesting structures, and also in terms of pattern recognition. And this goes a bit back to what Mike was talking about this morning. Games and play in general are awesome for experimenting, building patterns, and so in particular, tabletop games I think are wonderful for building pattern recognition around option value and trade-offs in terms of sequencing and time value of money and negotiations. And it's just a great way of building out those skills in a safe environment. We're seeing more and more exploration within different games and using games as a medium to explore concepts elsewhere, and that's happening for a bunch of reasons, but it's happening in video games and in tabletop games. So in video games, it's because the cost of creating a game has plummeted to pretty much zero. There are amazing developer tools out there, and the mechanics, different levers that you have when you're building a game are really well understood now. And moreover, the distribution channel is even easier. So anyone can now go over a weekend, prototype a game, throw it up on Steam, and do it as a green light sale, or you get funded before it's even a complete version, or just sell it. And there's now a really good channel as an indie game developer. Same thing is happening with tabletop games. So tabletop games refers to board games and card games and role-playing games, sort of as a catch-all. And likewise, it's really, really cheap to prototype, and maybe a little bit later than video games had it. We have a really great understanding of all the mechanics you can throw in and what works well together, and how we can pair really awesome game mechanics with really great theme to create interesting immersive experiences with emergent outcomes and narratives. So I'll talk a bit now about Ludo narratives, so Ludo being play and narrative being narrative or story. And the interesting thing here again is, unlike other media such as text and video or audio, the interactive component of Ludo narrative really can can either clash or resonate with the narrative that you're trying to tell, and so it's really important to be intentional about how the play mechanics interface with the narrative mechanics. But in general, that didn't copy over correctly. Oh, so I think there are two main engagements, two main axes to look at when you're looking at the play and the narrative. I think one is authorial to emergent, which is somewhat along the lines of narrative versus play. So authorial being that you as the creator of this game have a very specific message and a very specific story to tell, whereas emergent is you're creating a sandbox from which players can create their own stories, or stories can emerge. And the other axis, which is too small to see, is passive versus active. So even within the broad space of game playing, some games have very little player interaction, some have very rich player interaction in terms of the space of moves that players can make. And so I was going to make it into two. I instead made it into a broader two-axis space. I'm not going to spend too much time on the slide, but for incredibly emergent and incredibly active, you have things like improv games, and passive and completely authorial. Like if it's completely passive, it might be a film. And then you have things that are very authorial but still pretty active. So that could be a branching story, whether it's a choose your own adventure thing or some RPGs out there. You make very specific decisions, and they'll affect the overall story, but you're very limited in terms of when those decision points exist. And then sort of in the middle you have some tabletop games where there's a really interesting emergent narrative, but only within a certain possibility space, certain online world, open world video game RPGs where you get really interesting emergent story happening too, sort of in the center. And then all the way passive and emergent, you have things like procedurally generated games where you're sort of sitting there, maybe you're likely interacting. And so I'll walk through some specific examples now. So just on the authorial point of view, where there's a very specific story that the creator's trying to tell, you can range from passive to active. So on the very passive end, you have things like cutscenes, where the players can literally just sit back and watch a movie as part of the game. So this is like a gorgeous cutscene from BioShock where the player isn't doing anything. And then one step up in terms of activity is the idea of a QuickTime event. And I actually hate QuickTime events, so for those of you who aren't gamers, QuickTime events, you're sort of like you're in the movie, and then they're like, press X to continue the movie, and you just press X quickly enough. And it just, for me, that breaks the immersion of the video, and it's just like, it's really frustrating. Actually, before we move on, quick show of hands, how many people here regularly play video games? Okay, how many people regularly play tabletop games, or card games, or board games? And how many people play tabletop role-playing games? Okay, cool. It's good to have that sense. So moving down the axis, still authorial, but more active. There are games where, as you're exploring, you have many more degrees of freedom as you're exploring a space, possibly in the first-person mode, and as you explore, certain events are triggered. So this is a shot from Gone Home, which is a really, really awesome game that has a pretty powerful narrative, and it's very unlike other games out there, so I suggest taking a look at it if you want to see games as art, especially. Gone Home. And so it's a pretty short game, too. And I'd say if you're going to play it, don't look up anything about it beforehand. You're best just going in without any other expectations. Sort of continue on, this is a shot from a game called Bastion, where as you run around, there's a narrator, but the narrator says things based on what you're doing in a very free-form way. And there's still a broader overarching story, but you really feel like you're driving it because you'll make a wrong turn, and the narrator will say something about you making a wrong turn.
Sounds like a sports commentator.
Oh, yes, yeah, it very much feels like that.
Only he's like an old cowboy.
Yeah, he's only color.
Exactly. This is a shot from the Stanley Parable, and I think this is sort of at the extreme of, it's authorial, but you feel like you have a ton of agency. And so this shot, it happens very early in the game where the narrator is sort of talking about what you're doing, and you get to hear it goes, and the narrator says something along the lines, and then the player, then Stanley, which is the character's name, decides to take the right door. But he says that before you actually go through the door, and you can choose to take the left door. And then the narrator starts backpedaling and being really confused, and that opens up this really interesting space in the game of like, you can keep disobeying the narrator, and the narrator will start yelling at you or trying to manipulate you. And this is, like, it's all very scripted. You're not going to do anything there that's going to be particularly emergent, but you feel like you have a ton of agency and a ton of activity. It's called the Stanley Parable. It's also a short game. I highly recommend checking it out, and it's a blast. And again, it's really good at deconstructing games. To skip away from the authorial point of view back to more emergent, but also looking at passive versus active, this is a game called Mountain, or The Mountain, and you don't really do anything. Occasionally you'll be prompted to just draw something, but it's very unclear if anything you do actually affects the game basically you have a pet mountain, occasionally things grow on it. It's just like, it's sort of emergent, it's procedurally generated. There's a game, I should have put a shot on here called Proteus, where you're sort of exploring this island and things are happening on the island, but again, it's unclear if what you do actually changes anything on the island. And so again, this is emergent but passive. And then as an example of something that's emergent but very active, I'd say strategy games are great at this. This is a shot from Civilization 5. But any grand strategy game or sandbox game where you're really working and doing things that are clearly having an effect on the rest of the world, but maybe not in sticking into any grand narrative that the author or the game maker decided to make priority. And so, through Civilization, it's the rise and fall of Civilization. You have narratives that emerge like, oh, you're the underdog civilization, or you're going to extract revenge on the Mongols because they attacked you when you were a young civilization, or there's all sorts of really interesting emergent stories that come out of it. One thing I want to note on, there's this term lunar narrative dissonance that comes up a lot in games criticism. And again, it's the idea that the interactive part can clash with the narrative part. And we see this in other media too. So if you were to take a movie that was a really serious, intense, somber movie and play something like the Benny Hill soundtrack over it, or some kind of music that completely clashes, that would make a less coherent overall piece of media. And take the viewer, the participant out of the experience. Same thing happens a ton in games. And possibly because games and video games in particular are a younger medium, I think we see that a lot more. So one specific example comes from the latest Tomb Raider game. And this is a reset of the Tomb Raider narrative. So you have Lara Croft as a young archaeologist who's never really been in violent situations, or definitely never killed anyone. In the game you see her kill her first person as she comes under attack, and there's a cutscene where she's really sort of traumatized and grappling with the fact that she has killed someone. And then the rest of the game you go running around killing people and sort of not commenting on this is a weird thing anymore. So super, super dissonant, and it's a case of where the gameplay and the way you're interacting with the games completely clashes with the overall narrative. From here, so I'm going to say, from the rest of the talk I'm going to focus on tabletop games in particular, because I think they fit squarely in emergent and active, partly because as a tabletop game designer, it's a lot harder to authorially project the game because you just don't have that level of interaction with the players. And it's clearly very, very active. Most all tabletop games are very active. So the narratives that can emerge in games can come in a bunch of different varieties. Sometimes they're around specific skills, so a lot of times in abstract games like in chess, the narrative that might emerge. Again, you can have dynamics around an underdog or someone who's more skilled or less skilled. This is Kasparov versus Deep Blue, so there is an overarching narrative about the participants in the game. As the game goes on, you can have, as I said, underdog dynamics or particular tactics or plays or gambits that are moved that all have narrative command of it. But again, it's about the skill and the mastery. You can have narratives that emerge that are about simulation, or what the game is trying to model. This is a game called Distant Plane, and it's based on a game system called COIN, which stands for Counter-Insurgency. And it's a really, really cool system that's been used so this is the second Afghan war. It's been used for narco-terrorism in Colombia. It's been used for the Vietnam War, and I think there's another example too. But the game designers behind it have really researched all the complex systems and incentives that play out, and the game is really meant to simulate the situation on the ground. So in this case, you have 4 players. You have someone playing the coalition forces, mostly the US. You have someone playing the Afghan state, someone playing the Afghan warlords, and somebody playing the Taliban. And the incentives are really, really interesting and really, really crazy, where the coalition forces are nominally aligned with the Afghan state, but occasionally they'll start partnering with the warlords because they want to stop the Taliban at all costs. And the Afghan state will sometimes partner with the Taliban just to get more stability. So again, the narrative that emerges here is trying to match real life, or at least simulation. And then finally, there's narrative specifically and explicitly around storytelling. So there's a whole genre of storytelling games, of tabletop games that are all about storytelling. And within that, there's a pretty big axis from structure, really highly structured on one side, to lots of freedom on the other, and this is roughly the taxes versus play axis. And so on one end of the spectrum, you have something like Mad Libs, which has tons of structure, very little freedom, but also really hard to screw up because storytelling is really hard. So scaffolding is often really useful, especially if you're a novice storyteller. And then as you start moving down, iDark Overlord, you have a little more flexibility in how you're telling a story, but you have the components you're playing with are pretty fixed, so you can kind of just tell little bits of story here and there without thinking of any grand narrative. As you start moving toward more and more freedom, I'd say the more classic Dungeons & Dragons style role-playing game, you have some freedom in terms of what you can do as a character, but there's still a lot of limits on how you can influence the story, what kind of levers are available to you, at least from the player point of view. Fiasco gets a lot closer to improv in that there's lots of one-on-one scenes where you're role-playing a character, but you have a lot of freedom in what your character can do and what crazy directions you can drive it in. And then finally, I'd say the far end of the spectrum, the freedom end of the spectrum, you have things like improv itself, where yes, there are some rules in terms of different games that exist within the space of improv, but you have tons and tons of flexibility, very little structure. And so I'm going to take a little bit of an aside now and just talk about the evolution of role-playing games, because so this is role-playing games in general are something that I'm relatively new to. I just started exploring over the past year or so, and I thought originally they'd come from an improv tradition, a storytelling tradition, and that is really far from the truth. So they emerged from war games and miniatures, and war games, which have been around since, in terms of war games with a physical space and board, trying to really simulate war, have been around since, I think, the early 1700s, when Prussian military leaders were using it to simulate battles and to build up skill around tactics and strategy. And the goal was all around simulation. And that came through the early wargaming tradition with hexes and usually little pieces of cardboard, and very, very elaborate rules in terms of how to model the combat and how to making sure that the simulation was really there well, and prioritizing that over anything around narrative or even necessarily around great gameplay. It was almost more important that there are accurate simulations than good games. And so this is true in the wargaming as well as in miniatures, which miniatures just usually don't have a grid-based board and maybe have a little bit more flexibility, but there's still tons and tons of rules about adjudicating the combat. And so out of this, in the 1970s, emerged Dungeons & Dragons, which was originally about, let's take all this great wargaming stuff we love, and how do we actually, let's say we set it in Middle-earth, in Tolkien's world, how do we simulate a wizard on the battlefield, how do we, adjudicate a wizard in combat, and things of that nature. And so it was really an outgrowth of all the modeling and simulation. And from there, though, there's been an explosion of experimentation in a bunch of different types of games. So it started merging with more storytelling games with improv. And so there's this thing called NGS Theory, which is actually a bit controversial on the web for reasons I won't get into later, but we talk about. But I think it's useful, at least in broadly describing what are board games, what are tabletop games trying to achieve, and what are some of the different levers that can be pulled. And so it breaks it down roughly into three categories: gamist, narrativist, and simulationist. And so gamist is all about creating challenge and a space for mastery, and there's a lot of challenge and one-upmanship potentially in people who love playing the gamist side of things. Narrativist is all about creating great story and great drama, and simulationist is about really adhering to truth on the ground, or saying let's set up whatever the initial conditions are, and then sort of see where things go from there. And again, most games contain multiple components of this, or based on the group of players, can use one system to focus on different parts of this depending on the mood of the players. But it's a good way of thinking from a game designer, what kind of game roughly do I want to align toward, or as players, what kind of game do you want to choose to play based on our preferences? And I think, in general, a game can do one of these really, really well, but if it tries to do all three well, it can struggle because there are inherent tensions in them. For example, if you're trying to make a gamist-style game that is fiercely competitive, it's hard to do that really well also as a narrative, because playing the game optimally from a strategic point of view might yield boring narratives. And so a good example of that is, this is a board game called Eclipse, which is this epic, complex space game where you're researching technology and altering your blueprints and building out new waves of ships as you explore and conquer space. And so I play this a lot with my friend Raph, and inevitably we'll get to a point in the game where we'll have these big armies, these big fleets of ships, and we haven't actually fought each other yet. And strategically, it actually doesn't make sense for us to fight, but he loves the story and the drama of two epic space battles, fleets clashing. So we're like, I know this is the wrong strategic move, but I'm invading, and we'll just push all the fleets forward. And so this is clearly a tension of gamist and narrativist play. And so anyway, so while role-playing games really came from a place of simulationist and gamist origins, they have recently had a great exploration around narrative display. And so here are 3 games that are explicitly really narrativist. And Apocalypse World is all about tough decision making and narratives that emerge from tough decision making. Fiasco, as the tagline says, is about powerful ambition and impulse control and the crazy stories that come out of that. And Lady Blackbird's another system that has very few rules. I mean, the entire system fits on the page. And again, it's about the interesting stories that emerge more than any simulation or any mastery of gameplay. And sort of the extreme conclusion, extreme extent of this lately is this game Monster Hearts, which is based on the same system as Apocalypse World, but it features hormonal teenagers who are grappling with their own identity and sexuality, and it's the tagline, it's about the messy lives of teenage monsters, because also all of the players are different monsters. And it's just this crazy thing, which probably couldn't be further from where Dungeons & Dragons started, because there isn't necessarily any combat here, it's just about messy interpersonal relationships and figuring yourself out, and that's like a crazy narrative drama end of the spectrum of where role-playing games have, the solution space that role-playing games have explored. So I'm going to end my digression there on role-playing games and return to tabletop games, because that's sort of, or card games, because that's where I started when exploring storytelling games. And one thing I noticed is that there are a bunch of interesting storytelling games out there. So I talked about iDark Overlord. That's the one where you have some basic cards that you can sort of play down as in that case you're playing a goblin minion that's justifying why they screwed up on whatever quest their master set them out on. But you're sort of playing arbitrary cards to craft a very loose story. Microscope's a really interesting game where you're fractally exploring the entire arc of time, possibly eons of time, and fractally exploring from high-level eras down to specific events within those eras and scenes within those events. And it's really great at building out a universe. Once Upon a Time is a competitive storytelling game where you're going back and forth with other players, trying to bring the story around to your secret ending, and you have different cards to play to do that, to steal the plot from other people, and it ends up being a lot of fun, but doesn't yield good plot. And Dixit and Story War are also games that encourage you to tell stories, but don't necessarily yield great plots. So from there, I was inspired to create the game Plotypus, and Plotypus was supposed to be a placeholder name. We couldn't come up with a better name, so be really careful how you choose your placeholder names, because they often become the real name. So I wanted to create Plotypus as a game that was both fun, yet yielded a really good plot, and potentially classically epic plots. And to do so, you've seen this diagram way too many times now, but I researched a lot of different storytelling diagrams and frameworks, and so yeah, so there's Freytag, there's Zencat's double Freytag, there's something called the story spine, which looks a lot like the Freytag staircase. And I'm trying to figure out where all these Freytags within Freytags go. It seems that it's just getting more and more Freytags, more and more fractal, so you get like a Siperinsky Freytag. This is the natural end state of all the Freytags. So, some of the other frameworks we looked at, we of course looked at Joseph Campbell's Monomyth, which captures a lot of the really early stories that have come out from many, many different civilizations. And we also, so I really like Dan Harmon, who created the TV show Community, has something called the story structure circle, and he's used this for a lot of his episodes. And it pretty closely mimics Campbell's hero's journey, but it's a little more simplified and a little more, it takes out some of the extraneous things. It's a little more generalized, so you don't necessarily need gods or like another world or death that you pass into, although it uses some of the similar terminology. So we looked at this, and then probably the most controversial thing we looked at was a framework that was around something called Save the Cat. And Save the Cat is a script writing or screenwriting how-to book that is much reviled in Hollywood because it sort of spells out on a per page or per minute basis what you need to be doing with your story. And it's been so successful that many, many motion pictures follow this really, really closely. So if you've been kind of disappointed with Hollywood Dribble, where it just seems so predictable and that every beat, you know it's coming, they're all the same, it's because everyone's using Save the Cat. But it does have a really nice breakdown of, over a 3-act structure, what happens in the different acts, what are the key touch points. So we ended up using a lot of Save the Cat as we were architecting what are the different parts of our story. So here's what we did. We took it into Excel and said, okay, based on the different pages or minutes of the movie, how much time is spent in each act, and what are the different beats within each act. And that was helpful because we were trying to figure out, okay, how many chapters do we include in our game? Because it was a game that was a collaborative storytelling game. It's going to take place over multiple chapters that are helping to guide what's happening during the story. But how much time do we spend on each chapter? How many chapters per act? That kind of thing. So I diagrammed out. Okay, here's how Save the Cat does it, and here's roughly how some of the other frameworks do it. And from there, as we started prototyping and trying to figure out the right number of chapters, we also said, well, maybe this is a longer game with, I don't know how many chapters, maybe 12 or 14 chapters. Or maybe we can actually compress some of the acts down and have some fewer ones, or maybe we just make it really simple so there's like only one thing going on per act. And these are all things that we ended up prototyping and testing with our users to see what the game felt like at the really compressed scale, the really large scale. Ultimately, we ended up in the middle, but it was really useful to play around with what was going on in each beat, what was going on in each act. So as we were prototyping, we used blank playing cards with Sharpie, and that allowed us to quickly rip through different iterations with different types of content. I think, so on here, on the title card for Plotypus, it says the game formerly known as Plotypus, because we really didn't want to keep that as the title. And ultimately, we ended up consolidating down to a few different decks that allow you to quickly pick some story settings. Those are all double-sided, so you quickly draw either at random, you sort of discuss what your setting is going to be. You draw a hero, you draw a villain, and a villain archetype. These are all sort of like classic archetypes that people sort of recognize from all the stories that they've seen before. And then that's all the setup phase, and then during the actual gameplay, there's a storybook deck. It's the same order each time, and you keep flipping them open to form a chapter. And so, example chapter, as our hero story begins, our hero leads a stable life, and you end the chapter when you know the hero's routine. And so during this chapter, you just go around or among the players, adding a couple sentences onto the story and advancing the story until you're ready to continue the next chapter. And that's the bulk of the game. So you're just going through each chapter with everyone contributing going through the story with everyone contributing during each chapter. Here's roughly the framework we ended up, the chapters we ended up with. So hero leads a stable life until one day there's an inciting incident, which you actually draw from a catalyst deck. The hero adventures and grows. They strike at the heart of disruption. Ultimately, they fail though. However, that's a complication for however. Then they regroup. They sort of final showdown. They face the antagonist, and they succeed, but there's a cost. And so this is sort of a double freight tag feeling structure that's modeled on a lot of the components of Save the Cat. And then we ended up using Print Play Productions, which was a really, really great games prototyping tool and platform to quickly print out a few versions and work on some of the aesthetics, and then did a small batch manufacturing run last fall. And that was the process of creating Plotypus. And it was really, really fun. I loved exploring all the different frameworks around story and plot, and playtesting it was a blast. And I'm working on a few more games now. This was a big exploration into plot. I'm now working on games that explore other things such as setting and other genres as well. But that's about it.
I'm curious what you think was the most surprising thing